Sag is the measurement of how much your suspension moves when you put your weight onto the bike. It's an essential piece of bike setup for getting your suspension working well for you. Setting the sag on your bike is one of the very first things you should do when setting your bike up. You're going to need a shock pump for this, and it's a good idea to be wearing your riding kit, especially if you normally ride with a backpack that's quite heavy. So why is sag so important? Well, it's all about setting up how hard your suspension is. You want it to sit somewhere into the travel so that it soaks up all the small bumps on the trail for comfort, but also for grip. But you don't want it to sit so far in that you bottom out all the time. Most suspension these days is air sprung, so it's a case of playing around with the air pressure by using a shock pump. If you have coil sprung suspension, you can adjust the preload on those springs, or it might be a case of just swapping that spring out for your weight. Okay, so let's start with the rear shock first. Make sure you've got that shock open, so if you've got any lockout systems on your bike, set that so it's fully unlocked and the shock is in the most active position. Now you see here you've got this O-ring that's on that shaft, and that's what we're going to use to measure the actual sag. So slide that right up to that seal on the shock body. Now it's time to sit yourself on the bike. So to find that sag measurement, just get yourself sat on the bike. I know some people do like to do this stood up in the ready position, but I find just getting my bum on the saddle and then sticking all my weight through the pedals works pretty accurately. And try and do that without bouncing. You just want to find where that O-ring sits with your weight static on the bike. If you look at this, that O-ring is sat almost 50% along that stroke, and that is far too much sag. You're aiming for between 20 and 30%. Personally, I go for about 30. If I'm going to be really accurate about this, I've looked at the Scott website and I know that this shock has got a 60mm stroke on it. So that O-ring now is at full bottom out. So if I'm looking for about 30% of that, that's just under 20mm. So the O-ring should look at about that position when I sit on the bike. As you can see, that is pretty much a third of the way along the stroke. So I've worked out that I do need some more air in my rear shock. So first remove that valve cap and put that somewhere safe, because unlike tyres where you can get away without them, I will always use these on my shock so you don't damage that valve in there. So I've got a shock pump here where you can screw it on. It's got this special valve, so you screw in one bit and then the other, and that stops you losing any pressure when you take the shock off. So it's dead easy to get the right air pressure. So I would normally say go up 5 to 10 PSI at a time and then try your sag again. Okay, so I'm up to 135 PSI. That will be different for all different types of bikes, no matter on your weight, just because of the way different suspension designs work. One thing worth bearing in mind is when you sit down on the bike to get your sag, don't hold on to the rear brake, because that'll stop the shock from going in quite so far. So that's my rear shock set, 135 PSI. It might be worth making a note of that so you can compare different setups in the future, and just keep an eye on that O-ring. After a ride, it should be right down there. You should really be using full travel. If you need to take any air out of the shock, don't be tempted just to use something to push in that valve. That's going to let loads of air out. For a super accurate way of doing it, just use that little bleed valve. Most shock pumps have them. So you just let out a little bit of time and check the pressure as you go in. Right, so now to set the sag for the fork, I'm going to use the same idea but a slightly different method and desired amount of sag. I'm going to use that O-ring again. If you don't have one of those on your fork stanchion, you can put a zip tie on there just temporarily, but don't forget to take that off after you've set the sag, because it can attract dirt and actually scratch your stanchion a little bit. So there are two different methods of getting your fork sag. The first one, I'm in the workshop, I've got something to lean against. So I'm gently going to get on the bike, stand up on the pedals and lean against the bench. And then I'm going to get in quite an aggressive position. So my weight, or my shoulders should I say, is up and in line with the bars. And that's where I want to get my sag measurement. Alternatively, if you don't have something to lean against, just roll along slowly on a car park. Be careful not to touch your front brake and roll your weight off the back of the bike, and just use your rear brake to stop. So the fork sag that I look for is between 20 and 25%, so slightly less than on the shock. And this is a 160mm travel fork, so you can see that is pretty much the whole of the stanchion right up to that crown. So that's currently sat at 40mm, which is right up at about 25% sag. So that's possibly a little bit too soft, so I'm going to add 5 PSI, see how that affects it. If the sag isn't set correctly, it's the same process as the shock, just add or take away some air pressure, 5 or 10 PSI at a time until it's correct. Just a quick note, I do find this method of set and sag works really accurately for the shock, but not quite so well for the fork. So I'll definitely just keep an eye on that O-ring, and I'll still play around a little bit after I've ridden the bike. So setting your sag is the very first and most basic suspension setup. After that, you might find that your suspension still isn't quite perfect. You might be using too much travel or not quite enough. That's when you can go into further detail and start playing around with the air volume spaces inside your fork and shock, or using bottomless tokens on rock shocks. Just click on the GMBN logo here to subscribe to the channel, and if you want to see more videos like this, click up there for suspension setup explained, and click down there for how to fit volume spaces to your fork. Give us a thumbs up if you like this setup video.